Hello, this is Anna Stamas. I am here with our Week 6 Statistical Analysis chapter. That would be Chapter 11, and I'm here to talk about a specific statistical study and research. Before I begin with that, I wanted to kind of talk about the difference between descriptive statistics and inferential statistics. So descriptive statistics, they're a summary of the overall statistics. They kind of give meaning to the study. They facilitate insight. They're often written in the narrative format with few statistics even involved within the sentence. They're calculated to describe the sample and its key variables. So it's very, I would say, generic, broad, sort of like generalized. They're just kind of describing the overall statistics of the study. On the other hand, we have inferential statistics, and these are used to address objectives, research questions, and hypotheses to allow inference from sample to the target population. So what that's saying is, for example, if we had a sample of ICU nurses, and you were doing a study about ICU nurses, then that would be, you would use inferential statistics on that small group, and you would want to see if you could portray it to the overall population of nurses in general throughout the whole hospital. There are three key concepts for inferential statistics, and those are identifying relationships, examining predictions, and determining group differences. So there are a lot of different kinds of statistical analysis that we learned about in this chapter. And for example, regression would be under examining predictions. Under determining group differences, we'd have chi-square, t-test, analysis of variance, analysis of covariance. But I'm not going to talk about all of those because we would be here forever. I specifically just chose one that I wanted to focus in on. And that was one under the category of studies completed to examine group differences, because I found that the most interesting. So the study I chose was chi-square, and we kind of talked about this. It's used a lot in nursing research because you're kind of determining if there's a relationship between two variables or if they're just completely independent. And that is the main focus of chi-square. You're determining whether two variables are independent or they're related. So you're looking at kind of expected versus observed outcomes in a way. What you see, is that what's really happening? And the type of data that you use for this type of test would be nominal or ordinal data. And what nominal data is data that is used to label variables without a value. For example, that would be things such as gender, age, race, anything like that does not have an actual numerical value, but we are still able to measure it in that way. Ordinal data would be measures of non-numeric concepts. So for example, you could measure like satisfaction or happiness on a scale. So for happiness, 1 would be very unhappy, 2 would be unhappy, 3 would be okay, 4 would be happy, and 5 would be very happy. That would be an example of ordinal data. So the issue with chi-square tests is that you run the risk of a type 2 error. So what we learned about type 2 error is that the outcome of the study is non-significant when in reality it is. And this is an issue because sometimes you don't have a large enough sample size. So that was one of the things, well, I'll get to that in a second. You need to have a large sample size, but you run the risk of a type 2 error in this type of study. So when do we use it and why do we use it? We use it to compare two groups on a selected variable. And a lot of times these variables are qualitative variables such as gender, race, political affiliation. Those are some examples that I previously stated. But one example that it gave in our textbook, which I thought was really helpful, it was on page 321, where it talks about the chi-square. And it talks about the variables of IV insertion and IV infiltration and how those two overall, how are they related or are they not to the percentage of infiltration incidents. And I thought it was very interesting because it really just laid this concept of the chi-square out for me, because we have the one group, which you could call the IV insertion. Again, this would be a nominal data variable, as well as IV infiltration would be the other data variable. And if you look on the page on 321 in our textbook, it shows the number of IV catheter insertions compared to the number of IV infiltrations. And these are compared on a statistical comparison table, which is something that's used often in statistical studies to lay out the information. And as you can see, there was a significance between the two. And you can tell that because if you look on the chart, the p-value is less than 0.05. And remember, we had talked about, or we heard Professor Towns speak in her lecture, that if the p-value is 0.05 or less, there is a significant difference. So again, I said data collection. Large samples are needed. And again, this is because you do not want to perform a type 2 error. So that would mean that you, for example, you wouldn't have enough participants, so you would believe that the results were not significant, but in reality they are. You just did not have a big enough sample to prove that. Oftentimes multiple chi-square tests are performed, and this is often to see the multiple relationships going on. So for example, if we went back to that study on page 321, so they only had IV infiltration and IV insertion. But if we wanted to add in more variables such as gender of the nurses and age of the nurses, so that would be 4 variables total, we could perform multiple chi-square tests to see if any of those were statistically significant. So yes, you may have some statistical significance or you may not. And oftentimes research studies, they really only state the ones that are statistically significant. Also, post hoc analyses may be needed or completed to see where the actual significant differences lie. So that is a downside of chi-square. They tell you that there is a significant difference, but they don't exactly tell you where. So that's why you have to perform a post hoc analysis, so you can find out between which variables the differences lie. So I took this article actually from my IRP group. This is one of the articles we were looking at. We were studying diabetic wound care. And I found this article called The Effective Foot Exercises on Wound Healing in Type 2 Diabetic Patients with a Foot Ulcer. So the purpose of the study was to examine the effect of foot exercises on type 2 diabetic patients with foot ulcers. Sample size was 60 patients. They were randomly assigned to 2 groups. The one group, which we consider the control, they did not perform any foot exercises, and they received the standard wound care protocol. On the other side, we had the second group, the intervention group, who performed the foot exercises, and they also received the standard wound care protocol. So we have 2 groups here. Also, one thing to note is that there were, they took measurements of the foot ulcers at weeks 1, 4, 8, and 12. This was a longitudinal kind of study. They monitored them over a period of time. So chi-square tests were performed on gender, age, marital status, diabetes onset, and lab results in relation to the foot ulcers. So they performed all 5 of these chi-square tests. However, there was no significant results. So that means that none of the results were less than 0.05. 0.05 or less. So there were no significantly statistic results of this study, which was kind of unfortunate because I was curious to see if any of these things kind of impacted diabetic patients with foot ulcers. So yeah, I personally like the chi-square study method because I like how it describes the possible relationship between two variables or not. It's kind of open-ended, and it looks at qualitative variables rather than quantitative, which I also found very interesting. I also found this quote on a website which I really liked. It says, chi-square tells us how confident we can be that the observed results differed from the expected results, which I've thought kind of sums up what the chi-square is. So thank you for listening, and I hope that my information helped explain chi-square a little bit better.